Hey guys, OGalbina here, and Draft League Twitter questions are back. Now, I haven't done one of these in a couple months, but I know you guys really like this series, and I really enjoy making them. I've been really busy with classes, as you guys have probably noticed by a couple late uploads and things like that, but they're pretty much over for the summer, so I figured I'd bring these back, do these once every couple weeks and things like that, and kind of, get a gauge and see what your guys' thoughts on these things are, and maybe these questions will, answer some questions you have about draft and, help you grow as a player and as a builder and as a drafter and all that fun stuff, so... If you guys do enjoy today's video, be sure to drop a like as well as sub to the channel. We're on our way to 1,000 subs, and I'd really appreciate if you help me out along that way. And if you have a question that you want me to cover, comment it in the comments below. I would really appreciate it. I'm always looking for new questions. They're kind of hard to come up with at a certain point. So I'd really appreciate it. And follow me on Twitter if you want to participate in these discussions. OG_Albina. You can see it on the screen right there. But yeah, that being said, let's jump into today's question, which is going to be, what does every draft league team need in order to function consistently? What does every draft need in order for it to function consistently and well? Consistently bad is not what we're looking for, if that makes any sense. But for me, I say having a good bulky water. The defensive utility the type gives is unmatched, and it really shows when you draft something like a Keldeo or a Crawdaunt as your bulky water, or as an Urshifu Rapid Strike as your bulky water, where it's more offensively oriented, which is great. Those Pokemon are awesome, but we should probably draft a secondary bulky water, maybe a little bit lower tiered, but still completely fine, to double up on that type and make sure you have those key resistances to a lot of different drafts and kind of have that, defensive backbone, which is great. And yeah, with that being said, let's jump into it. So the first one is going to be my good friend Jesse504 here, and he's going to have an interesting one. It's kind of not what the assignment was, but it's something I can get behind. He says Stunfisk can unironically bail 90% of drafts, and I guess it's kind of I guess I'll flip it in a way saying it's good to make sure you're grabbing low tier value, things that your opponents one are going to prep for, that's really your bottom tier mons, and two, things that give you utility that other low point mons that are funny and gimmicky might not give you. Stunfisk is my personal favorite low tier mon to draft. It gives you a nice secondary ground if you have a more offensive one at the top tier, which a lot of teams that Stunfisk really functions on are teams like that. It gives you a phenomenal flying resist with statics to spread pairs. It punishes U-turns. It's a really reliable rocker, and it's really anti-meta. I love this Pokemon a ton in the sense that it protects Koko, Torn, Zera, all those really top tier momentum grabbing fast Pokemon. Stunfisk just shuts down, which I think is really valuable. So while this isn't necessarily the assignment, I do get what Jesse's saying here in the sense that we should be getting low tier value and kind of patching holes with worthwhile low point mons, which is definitely fair. Next up we have Josh. It says draft a mon above 110 base speed. For the love of God, people don't want you to have that much of a speed disadvantage, which is definitely fair. Speed is incredibly important. Speed control, even if you're drafting more balanced, bulky team, you don't want to allow your opponent to have that Torn T and run Modest with max HP and 70 speed or something like that. You know what I mean? And that's kind of a extreme example because a lot of people aren't going to run offensive Torn, but even Koko or something like that, you don't want to allow those fast top tier Pokemon to just run Adamant, Modest versus you, things like that, and really push through you, outspeed your entire team, and 2-hit KO it as well. So it's really important to have some form of speed control, whether that be drafting something above 110, having great Scarfers, and you're going to see a little bit later, someone kind of elaborates on this a little bit more when it comes to not just one type. There's not just one type of speed control when it comes to having fast Pokemon, but we'll talk about that when we get there. It's really important, and it's also really important to make sure that there's a good gap in your speed tiers, and I know my good friend Struggle King would disagree with me here, but I do think that speed tiers are very important. I think if you have a big gap and you're allowing Modest Nidokings to come versus you, you're gonna have a bad time versus it. There are certain Pokemon, especially in those mid speed tiers, and those 95, 85, 75 ranges, those strong wall breakers that don't have great speed tiers, if you have bad speed control and your next fastest Pokemon is base 50, and they're just allowed to run Modest max HP every week, they're going to smash through you 100%. So I think it's really important to try and, have variance within your speed tiers. Next up, we have Kara. I'm going to come back to Kara's list at the end because I think it's very well in depth, but she covers some things that other people want to cover, and I want to make sure we get to cover a lot of people's different things. So we'll come back to this one for sure. But yeah, we'll come back and we'll see if there's anything else that we're missing. Okay. Next up, we have Fran saying, you kind of stole my bulky water stick, but if I had to say anything else, you need good hazards for your offense to put on any kind of pressure at all. both by just not getting the chip, but both by getting the chip and also by letting your opponent not run boots and make everything either more threatening by letting them run choice items on or everything getting instantly bulky with leftovers. This is definitely fair. Now, I think a lot of people think boots exist Gen 8, hazards are not important. That's wrong. Hazards are still definitely important. Do I think hazard stack is as good this gen? Not necessarily. And do I think hazards in general are as good this generation? Not necessarily. And personally, I'm a big fan of boots. I think they were healthy for the metagame. I think metagames prior were so hazard centric, and this just kind of gives people a better way to play around it without, you know, dedicating an entire move slot to a Pokemon or, you know, taking away its role. I don't know. Personally, I like boots a lot, but you want to force the boots, if that makes any sense, which is what Fran's saying right here. You don't want to play against a Volcarona and it gets thrown leftovers or charcoal or whatever item it may be when it's setting up. In order to facilitate it even more, you want to force it into that boots item, which is giving it no offensive, what do you call it, utility. You don't want to play a sub-toxic King Pressure Moltres with leftovers. You still want to force that thing into boots, if that makes any sense. And having rocks and having spikes and things like that, it's going to force those items, which one lets you deduce what the item is on your opponent. You know it's not Banded, Life Force, Specs, Scarf, whatever it might be. And it's also going to make sure they're not those items, whether it be an offensive item or a defensive item. So I think this is a really good take by Fran. I actually 100% agree. Next up, we have the most important tweet of the thread. My good friend Amel saying, confidence. No, my matchup is bad or anything. It is your job to create a team that can succeed. You can't come out a winner every time, but you have to go for it. That's all you need. And you know what? I agree. Here's the slogan of today's video. Oh no, it's too big when I go full screen. There it is. Big Amel, Obama Amel, dropping absolute facts on us. I do agree though. I think this is a good take in the sense that if you go into a matchup thinking you're going to lose or this matchup is impossible, there's no way I pull this game out, you're gonna lose. And I say this all the time. I could be playing against someone who is objectively 10 times better than me. And there's so many people that are objectively better than me. But I'm never going to go into a game thinking I'm going to lose, because then I'm not going to win. I still might lose, 100%. But if you go in expecting to, it's never happening. And I think that's a really important thing to have. And maybe that's something from, like, you know, having an athletic background, things like that. But I think it's important that people realize if you don't have the right mindset going in, you're not going to get the results that you want to get. You have to go in with that killer instinct. But yeah. Next up, we have Gohan, who also kind of touches on something strong above base 110 and a good Scarfer. This kind of touches on those speed tiers again. A good Scarfer is also really, really important in the sense that it gives you even more speed control, something that can slot into a Scarf very consistently and function well as a revenge killer. Maybe it grabs momentum, or even just a wall breaker with Scarf. If something's strong enough and it has a Scarf, it can still wall break very sufficiently. But it's a Pokemon that doesn't mind running Scarf and is very, very solid at it. And I think that's really important to have something around, you know, base 95 to like 110 that can consistently run Scarf is really nice, in my opinion. And Josh is upset because people are saying the same thing as him. Next up, we have Soulblade saying, every team needs a win condition. I firmly believe that you can build great teams around any Pokemon. Break the stereotypes, non-bulky waters, non-defensive steel, slow electrics can all be a part of great teams. Other team stall teams are great examples of breaking stereotypes. I don't know how I feel about this take, right? Because I do agree, every team needs a win condition in the sense that you need to go into a game with a game plan. You can't just go in and just expect to win because you have 6 Pokemon that are good in the matchup. You need to have a game plan, have a win condition, and facilitate that win condition with the rest of your team and set yourself up to win. Now, to say that breaking the stereotypes is a good thing is a bit odd. Now, there are teams that function well with non-bulky waters, non-defensive steals, things like that. But do you want to put yourself in that position? I don't know. I feel like you're putting yourself in an inherent disadvantage. Now, you can have a non-bulky water and then a bulky water. You can have a non-bulky steel. You can have a Kartana and then get a Registeel later on. Like, that's allowed, in my opinion. I think people, the stereotype people need to break is not wanting to double up on typings and they need to draft more for rolls. I'm not saying you have to drop a bulky water because it's a bulky water. I'm saying you have to drop a bulky water because it's defensive resistances. I'm not saying you have to drop a bulky steel because it's a steel type. You have to draft it because of what it covers. A good example of this is, I'm doing a draft right now where I'm just not going to draft a grass type. Because I feel as if on that team, I have sufficient ground resist. And that is what I want my grass type to do. I don't think I need a grass type on that team because of that. Which I think is, again, very, very important. Now, keeping in mind that Gen 6 it's a Gen 6 league, but you know, so no arrows, I guess. But even then, I'd be fine against arrows. I have like Mega Heracross and Zygarde and things like that. So yeah, I personally, I think that you should be drafting for rolls, not typings. And if you want to break that stereotype, that's a fair thing. But you just need to make sure you cover those holes and those weaknesses. Weather teams are definitely an exception to these things. A lot of times weather teams will have very, very noticeable defensive flaws to them, but they'll function so well offensively and be so overwhelming. Stall, don't think it's a great example of that, because Stall will cover every single basis of everything that they can get, at least defensively. Like, there shouldn't be a big defensive hole in most good Stall teams. Maybe one or two, but there shouldn't be massive holes, you know? If that makes any sense. Next up, though, we have May here saying, in my opinion, the one true answer to this is that you needs to be something you're personally comfortable with. You can have the most terrifying, every checkbox possible filled draft of all time, but if you personally don't like the team, you aren't going to see good results. And this is a great take. I 100% agree. Look at guys like Amel. Amel is the antithesis of everything I am saying on these lists. He drafts whatever he wants because he enjoys it, he plays very well with it, and he's very comfortable with it. Me personally, I'm more comfortable with, you know, these more balanced type builds and things like that. Some people are more comfortable with hyper offense, like Shayquaza. I've never seen that dude not draft HO, but he plays very well, obviously, and it's something that he's very comfortable with. If you're not using something that you're comfortable with and that you enjoy using, you're not going to perform as consistently well. Now, the only kind of downside of this is that if you're not trying new shit, what do you know? Do you know if you like something? So you kind of do have to step outside of your comfort zone every once in a while to kind of find exactly what it is that you do enjoy using the most. And you can kind of make deductions on looking at a Pokemon, looking at stats, move pool, how you've seen other people use it, whether or not you'll like a Pokemon. Like, I'm not gonna go in and be like, man, I really don't think I'd like Urshifu Single Strike because I've never used it before. Like, I don't know if I'd like it. Yeah, I would. I like strong herder button Pokemon. You know what I mean? So, I think that's definitely very, very important, though, is making sure that you enjoy what you're using and you're comfortable with building and playing with it and facilitating those wins and things like that. So, definitely a great take here by May. Next up, we have Vivi. I think that's how you say it. I said, I feel like a good mix of offense and defense is important for a time to work well. If you don't want to have a team that's knocked out by someone looking at them funny, nor you want a team that's super passive and won't do any damage. I get this. And again, I think this kind of ties into last. Maybe Vivi here is like a big balance player, and they like their team to be a little bit more balanced. I do think that you can definitely have teams that function consistently on either end of the spectrum very, very well. I just think they have to be well-structured teams. To say that Stall is completely terrible in draft is not true. To say that Hyper Offense is completely terrible in draft is not true. And they are as far apart on the spectrum as you can humanly possibly get. So I think it's very important to just know how to draft well around those things and be able to cover weaknesses, and acknowledging the weaknesses, acknowledging the frailty of your team if you're drafting a hyper offensive team, acknowledging the passivity of your team if you're drafting a Stall team, and kind of dealing with it accordingly from there, which I think is great. Next up is Jake here saying, probably something to help gain momentum is massive help. Depending on the format, Volturn is a Volturmon or even Core can really help some more powerful Pokemon shine by switching them easier. And I'll take this and I'll kind of flip it a little bit and say, that's great as long as you have a momentum grabber that gets you into the wall breaker that really like benefits from what your momentum grabber is forcing in, right? So say if I have, and again, my favorite Volturn core, and I'm using it right now again, is what do you call it? Urshifu Gengar. Urshifu Gengar is such a good offensive core because when Urshifu's coming in, it's forcing in a fairy type. You click U-turn, you go into your Gengar, and now you have a free switch in your Gengar on something that it's potentially going to force out or just knock out. Things like that are really important. Having Coco plus something that can just murder fat grounds. Something like Coco plus Urshifu Rapid Strike comes to mind, at least immediately. Now, Rapid Strike is going to force in grass types, but then you can kind of get them in the Vortex again. Maybe you have a strong fire type in the back or something like that. But again, even then, it's a little bit of Volturn core just with an extra step there. So I think Volturn is great, and using that pivot to get into an offensive breaker is perfect, but it has to be forcing in things that your breaker beats 100% of the time. There cannot be, like, you know, debate about that, if that makes any sense. Okay. Alright, next up we got Trexo saying some sort of core that every team must prep for or risk losing to, i.e. weather, trick room, etc. to force a bit of extra prep that wouldn't be needed on a more standard team. This, I get it, and I think it's definitely a nice thing. I don't think it's needed, and I think a lot of teams try and shoehorn these kinds of cores on their teams at the expense of their overall synergy and, you know, how well they function, things like that. I think a proper offensive core, like an Urshifu Gengar core or something like that, and again, I always default to that one because I'm using it right now and I love it so much, but you know what I mean, like a standard offensive core that functions really, really well together, can kind of function just as well, if not better than that. If you have a core that your opponent just cannot guard against very well, you're going to be in a similar position as if you had, you know, a rain team with 2 abusers or things like that. And a lot of time teams really function a lot worse overall because they try and shoehorn on these like fun cores. And again, if you want to draft those fun cores, that's completely different. But like in the conversation of like consistency and things like that, I don't know if that's a needed thing. I think it's more so a nice thing if you can fit it on, or if you're going for a team like that and you're acknowledging the holes that it is going to kind of give you. So that one's a little bit of a mixed bag in my opinion, but definitely a good discussion point there from Trexo. And so we have Vivid saying a dark type. Ghost is a busted typing, so having something to complement a normal is solid. And it also sucks to lose to Cosmic Power / Calm Mind Recovery moves, stored power sets, presumably from Psychic types if he's saying that. But I guess it doesn't matter if it's Psychic type, but most don't have that. But yeah, I 100% agree. This is something that, since I've been playing draft, something that's always been hammered home to me after losing to Reuniclus one too many times, is that you need a dark type to turn those bulky psychics, have a way of threatening them out, make sure they're forced to run that Focus Blast, Signal Beam in Gen 6 and 7, or Hidden Power, whatever it might have been, you know, whatever their coverage might have been prior. But especially in Gen 8, with Ghost being the best offensive type in the game, having a more offensive check to a lot of these ghosts is always really nice, because these normals, they can switch and they can take the hits, but a lot of ghosts have ways around bulky normals. They have ways of chipping them down, and those Pokemon tend to just be more passive in general, whereas an offensive dark type, or just a dark type in general, can at least immediately threaten that ghost type much more than most bulky normals can, if that makes any sense. So I 100% agree with Vivid here. You need a bulky, you need a normal, you need a dark type. You need something to deal with that disgusting offensive typing in ghosts. So 100% agree. This is definitely smart. Okay, next up, we have Synergy from Aquarius. Doesn't matter if you have all the arbitrary checkboxes. If you don't have the roles that mesh together in cooperative ways, the team won't work. Sure, you can checkbox all the necessary typing and hazards, but for example, if your team is all pivots and no breakers, it won't work. 100%. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, in the sense that for you to have a breaker that works with your Volt Turn core and all this momentum, you have to force in the things that those Pokemon beat. You have to find ways to get in your hazard setters, to set up your hazards and hazard stack your opponent. You have to have a team that can, like, if you're going for a more, you know, balance or semi-stall type of approach, you have a team that can synergistically check most offensive threats because they cover each other so well. So yeah, it's 100% synergy, and I agree. It's not checking off checkboxes for typings and things like that. It's making sure that we're getting those roles that we need, but making sure that they function together well. And I think that's really important. So that's a great take from Aquarius here. Next up, we have Thriller saying, I honestly think a good ground or electric type, or both, because honestly some of the best typing in draft is electric and ground, because in the right matchup those typings offensively has so many limited switch-ins, and some of those ones are also great defensively. You do need a ground. 100% need. See, that we kind of just see. I'm catching myself. A ground is great to have in the sense that it blocks Volt Switch. It usually gives you rocks, and it's a solid typing offensively. Usually Edgequake as a combination is going to be very solid offensively for you. So most grounds are very much so worth drafting. And having one is very much so worth drafting unless you have, you know, a weird combination of other mons that kind of function what the ground would do better. So I do 100% agree there. Electric, I'm going to say this is going to be the first one I just disagree with, personally. If you're not drafting a top tier electric, you do not need one. I don't know. Maybe if you really struggle with bulky watch, draft a lower tier electric. But I do not think it's a necessity at all. I do not think it's a necessity at all in a generation without hidden powers existing. Because, like, think about it in the frame of this question even. If ground is one of the best typings in the game, and every team should pretty much have it, how well are my electric types going to function if they can't hit it? And there's not as many electric types that can hit grounds anymore as they could in Gen 6, 7. If you come with a straight hidden power after, you know, a spike in your life orb or specs or something like that, you could exert a lot more pressure in that way. In Gen 8, that's just not a thing, unfortunately. And every team is going to guarantee to have a ground type at this point in the Draft League metagame, or at least most should. So, I don't know. Like, there's mons like Coco, Zapdos, the Thundies, Zera, mons that are definitely 100% worth drafting. If they're around and you want them early on, you can have a phenomenal team with them. But do I think that you need to draft Galvantula, Heliolisk, things like that? No, and those are ones that can actually hit ground types, which is crazy. So if your team really struggles with waters, you should probably draft an electric maybe later on. Even if you already have a grass and your team still kind of struggles switching into and beating electrics, draft an electric, waters, draft an electric type. Otherwise, I don't know if it's very needed, you know? Okay. So, next up we have Nashoba saying, you need a good pivot to bring out your offense and minimize the damage of an opponent's threats. That's why regen mons are so good, especially in Gen 8. Yeah, we kind of talked about this. Having good momentum is a very important part of draft, especially more offensive teams, and regen is the best ability in the game. But make sure that you have pivots that can bring in your offensive threats and on things that they actually beat, which is important. Next up, we have Endless Gadgets, which we just talked about. I feel bad, but he said a ground type can actually answer the top electric as well. Coco, Zero, Zapdos, etc. will steamroll teams without a solid ground. Again, I 100% agree. Having a good check to those things is very, very important. We kind of just talked about those, so I don't want to harp on it, but you're 100% true in that Endless. This is a good take. Good take. Next up, we have Badass Frost saying, I think one thing about draft is that nothing is 100% mandatory for a draft team to succeed. However, when helping a new player, the first thing I recommend is a mon that has 1 to 2 checks, that only has 1 to 2 checks on any given team, gives you a reliable win con every game. So I think, I'm confused by the wording. I think what he's trying to say is having that top end threat that just scares the daylights out of your opponent, that has the potential to win every single game or do well every single game. And obviously that's very important. I really hate when I see teams with like top mon Rillaboom or I don't know. Rillaboom's not that bad actually. Rillaboom actually does have some pretty big game ending potential. I'm trying to think of a mon that's like top tier and it's a good Pokemon, but it's not going to be your best. Like if you have a now I've never seen this, I won't lie. If you have a team that has like your best mon is Keldeo, your team's probably not going to be very good because Keldeo is good, but it shouldn't be your game ending, you know, world ending threat in most matchups, if that makes any sense, or in a lot of matchups. Next up, we have the Regulator saying a vision. You have to know what your team's goal is. One can answer the what, you can draft by how. Wait, sorry, let me read. Once you can answer the what, you can draft the how. Bad drafts are plagued by identity crisis and worrying about holes yet have no direction. And again, I think this is fair in the sense that like it kind of touches on what Aquarius was talking about and other people were talking about in the sense that like you can check off all the arbitrary checkboxes and say like I have my water, my grass, my dragon, fairy, steel, I have stealth rocks and things like that. But if you don't have a way of facilitating a win every game and trying to say like, okay, this is how I'm going to approach winning this game with this Pokemon, with this core, how do these Pokemon put me in that position to do it? And if they don't, then you have a problem, if that makes any sense. Next up, we have Shuckle King. Next up, we have Shuckle King with his tried and true method of nothing. Just have confidence in your plan and creativity when necessary in your approach. Shuckle and Amel must get along great. I want them to go out and get lunch together and just hang out. They seem like good pals. But this is fair to an extent. Now, again, I'm a little bit more rigid and by the books, and I like to cover my holes and things like that. But that's how I play. Shuckle's a great player, and I look at some of his teams and I'm like, what the fuck? This is so wacky. But hey, and it's not wacky like any drafts bad mons. It's just like he's just missing like 3 or 4 things. I'm like, I don't know how you're missing this and still winning every one of your games. But he's comfortable with what he's using. He's confident in what he's using, and he knows how to creatively, you know, get past tough matchups and things like that, which makes sense. Next up, we have Josh again. Says that since Gohan and John, which we'll talk about in a second, stole mine, I'll again go with rockers that have the space in their moveset to run rocks and are not losing out on key support or coverage moves to just throw up rocks. This is good. Having good, reliable rockers that do not mind running in. I hate seeing Stealth Rock Mew. I hate seeing Stealth Rock Crossbow. Not that they're bad rockers, but they don't want to run it. They have so many things they can do better. So if you're not drafting sufficient good rockers with mons like this, if you're drafting a Zygarde as your ground or a Celesteal as your steel and you're not getting good secondary low tier rockers, like rock types like Regirock, you know, maybe Gigalith if you're drafting Sand, something like that, you're really going to struggle, and it's really going to be hard for you to fit on hazards on a lot of teams. So that's really important to me. And I agree. Next up, we have Walt saying, please, 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 for the love of God, do not be like Walt and never draft hazards. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Even though boots do exist in this generation, hazards still a necessary part of the game to either force boots or force sufficient chips from people who do not want to run them. And again, just put things in range if you're more offensive threats. Some monsters typically aren't going to run boots because they're not super worried about it, so I agree. Next up, we have Witchard saying, indeed, a bulky water is very solid, but I think a team also needs to have something to deal with said bulky waters, as well as having a couple of strong offensive monsters function as a break and wake up. We kind of talked about the second one. We'll talk about the first point that he says, and having something to deal with bulky waters, which we also kind of touched on, but not as much. It is very, very important to have something to deal with fat bulky waters. Most teams, if not all, are going to have a really fat, annoying water, and if you don't have a sufficient electric, grass, even like a dragon that can switch into them consistently and bully them, you're going to have a bad time against them, and I think that's a really important thing to have. So having a way to really punish those mons is really, really important. So I do agree there 100%. If you don't have a way to break a bulky water, maybe you should draft that electric that Thriller was talking about. But yeah. Next up, we have John Jr. saying, I feel like a good defensive steel is the backbone of a great team. Similar to your Keldeo example, if your steel is Lucario or Bisharp, you are in danger, 100%. The steel typing gives you so many worthwhile resistances, and if you don't have something that can consistently switch in and take those bludgeon of hits and kind of just shrug them off, you're going to have a bad time against those offensive fairies, those ice types especially. Offensive ice can just like run through a lot of teams like Mamoswine, I guess kind of run through every steel type anyways, but your Kyurem matchup, man, I always make sure your Kyurem matchup is okay, because that mon's a demon for sure. And then does he have another one? Oh, PTSD flashbacks to having Dialga my steel never be able to. You could, Josh. Dialga's a pretty bulky steel, bro. You just don't want to switch it. Next up, we have Haze saying, absolutely agree with bulky water. I'd say a solid bulk that can synergize well and doesn't get worn down over the course of games. Additionally, a nice mix of pivots and breakers on both sides to get the job done. I do agree. Again, it kind of depends on your team style. Again, if you're running a more hyper-offensive team and you have a little bit more holes defensive, but your offensive synergy is just, going crazy, maybe you can kind of get by without that. So I don't think that's necessarily a requirement. But having a nice mix of pivots and breakers is great as long as they facilitate each other, as well as have breaking power on both sides. I think this is a little bit overstated by a lot of people, but I still do think that it's important to have physically offensive and especially offensive threats, and again, specifically ones that do really, really well with each other, ones that will force in the things that the other one likes and vice versa, and or even if they go for that overload principle of they both force in bulky normals, so they can one can overwhelm it for the other one and vice versa. So I think that's definitely nice. Septile Scythe says, every draft needs a Slowking Galar with a fire emoji. He likes to say this a lot. I don't know if every draft needs it, but it's a great Pokemon. I will give you that. Okay, next up we have Anthony saying synergy, and I don't just mean a good core. I mean Pokemon that can mesh together and work together and hold team functional. We've touched on this a million times. 100% agree. Your team has to facilitate each other, which is great. Next up we have Regan saying a good Fire, Water, Grass core, a good Dragon, Fairy, Steel core. When you have both those, you have a pretty good team. Then you can draft other Pokemon besides those types. Now, I think this is a good template for new players, and Kara kind of says this right here, but type cores are, I'll just read what she says and we'll kind of touch on it. Type cores are a good shortcut for newer players, but misses the actual point. You need to think and understand the synergy between the mons you're bringing, not just slap typings together, and that is 100% the case. The reason you're taught when you're first starting to play Draft League that Fire, Water, Grass is good and Dragon, Fairy, Steel is good is because typically those Pokemon function very well defensively together and switching in, and offensively together and switching in and taking on things that beat each other. Now, that does not mean you need those Pokemon, and that also means that you could draft a Dragon, Fairy, Steel core that's terrible because your Steel doesn't resist Fairy because, again, for some reason you drafted Cobalion as your Fairy, and then you drafted Hydreigon as your Dragon. Now you're just boned against every Fairy type in the format because you don't switch into them anymore, right? So it's not the sense that Dragon, Fairy, Steel is broken, it's a sense that they cover each other's weaknesses very, very well, which I think is, again, very, very important. So it's good when you're first starting out. If you're a new Draft League player and you need to go by a template and say Fire, Water, Dragon, Fire, Water, Grass, Dragon, Fairy, Steel, and that's how you kind of can conceptualize those concepts at least early on. I think that's really important, and you should do that until you kind of understand the concept of it's not the typings that make it broken, it is the synergy that they offer, like Kara said here, which is definitely good. And then he also says speed kills. We talked about speed does kill. We need some fast stuff. All right, to end out the video, we will go up to Kara's list right here. Bam. Okay. I think we should be able to cover oh man. Okay, I'm gonna have to adjust the cropping for this one. Thanks, Kara. Okay, hold on. That's how we'll do it. Okay, First, we see a strong offensive presence, including multiple options for raw breaking, setup sweeping, preferably mons that are checked / countered by different defensive options, 2 to 4 mons. A strong defensive presence, including multiple mons that access to utility moves that support the team and are broken by different offensive options, 2 to 4 mons. That's definitely fair, and this is like a template. She's a part of a document I'm working on over time. This is gen agnostic, and probably need to add a note about always having, about literally always having a dark type, which is fair. Then we say access to Stealth Rock, 2 to 3 mons, which is definitely fair. Access to Spikes, 1 mon, debatably optional, but I wouldn't be caught dead with that one. That is a little bit of a personal preference, and I think it comes down to the kind of player that you are. If you are going to be hazard stacking teams and things like that, and going for a more hazard-centric approach. It also depends on the type of, It also depends on the type of, draft that you have as well. There's some teams that Spikes just really don't help, and, some teams even just don't like taking the turn to set up Spikes, depending on what they're going for. Access to repeatable hazard clear. It has to be, it's useless to rely on mon to defog when only be able to do so once a game, if you can't always reliably kill the rocker, 2 mons. Now, this is also fair, and I want to, add on too, is having removal options, and you shouldn't be bringing removal options that don't beat the hazard setter that you're trying to beat. So if I have a Lurantis, and I'm playing against a Scolipede, and I'm bringing defog Lurantis, I'm messing up, because my defog Lurantis is going to get bullied by the hazard setter in Scolipede. So they are remaining up. I mean, the only thing you're really gaining from that interaction is that you're forcing in Scolipede. So maybe you can offensively, pressure it and double out and catch it or something like that. But, on a base level, you are not beating the hazard setter with your remover. You probably shouldn't be bringing it, and it's probably a bad remover, at least in the matchup. But having multiple options to do so, and mons that are very good at it, is very important in my opinion. Next up, speed control. Speed control in the form base of 115 plus speed. Thunder Wave or viable choice Scarfer / mons that have speed doubling abilities on weather teams can be used as speed control. This is kind of what I was talking about. The speed control isn't just 115 plus. It's having Thunder Wave as speed control with Klefki or Thundy, reliable Thunder Wave, Prankster Thunder Wave spam type stuff. Viable Scarfers, having weather, whether it be hail, sun, rain is the more common one, sand, things like that. Having a way to make sure that you can control the speed game is very, very important in Draft League, or you will get overwhelmed. Access to U-turn, Volt Switch, Flip Turn, Teleport, 2 or 3 mods. Getting good, momentum is good as long as you're facilitating said momentum. Options for specifically handling setup sweepers, phasings, fast taunt, encore haze. This is definitely fair. A lot of Draft League players, you'll see a lot of people, you'll see them on Swords Dance or DD, and you'll see them just go blank in the face, terrified. Having a game plan, one, to beat setup sweepers that do good versus you, and having a way of, making sure that you stop those things is really important, but having them on your team is obviously important as well. Whether it be phasing them out, haze, unaware, things like that, fast taunt, encoring them in, because it's a great way to obviously lose a game if, your checks get, cheap, weakened. Next up is answers to the following common offensive types. Fighting and Psychic, Electric and Dragon, Fairy, Ground, and Water, which is definitely fair. Having a good bulky Psychic is a very, very important thing to have to check, those offensive fightings, but a Fairy can do the same job. So it's not just that specific typing. Having good Dark or Steel to, deal with those Psychics. Having a Ground to deal with those Electrics. Having good Fairy and Steel to deal with those Dragons. Those are all things that are very important because there's a lot of really scary offensive Pokemon with that. Answers to the following common defensive types. Ground, Steel, Water, Fairy, Psychic, and Grass. 100%. And I think we kind of talked about it. Now, on its face, this listing is impossible to fill out with 8 to 10 Pokemon, which is where, and then we get cut off. So I would love to see this document. I think this would be really interesting. But yeah, I 100% agree on a lot of these things. I think she touched on some things that were pretty important that some other people didn't. But yeah, that is going to basically be it, guys. I enjoyed this discussion. I think this was a really cool one. I have another one already on Twitter right now, which we can go to. Can we go to it? Let's go to profile. Bam, we do. And it's going to be, what is your favorite Uber Pokemon to use in Uber Draft Leagues and why? And we'll kind of talk about it. I'm not going to give you any spoilers, but we have some pretty fun responses, and we'll talk about some pretty fun Pokemon here. So if you guys did enjoy today's video, be sure to drop a like, as well as sub to the channel. And yeah, drop a comment down below if you have a take on what every Draft League team needs, or what question you want to see after this next one right here. And with that being said, I will see you guys in the next one. Later.